Good afternoon and welcome to an EAS webinar on California Prop 65 regulations presented by EAS Independent Consultant Tom Jonaitis. EAS Consulting Group, a member of the Certified Family of Companies, is a global leader in regulatory solutions for industries regulated by FDA, USDA, and other federal and state agencies. With our over 150 independent consultants worldwide, EAS offers the detailed knowledge and experience your company requires to ensure accurate and timely assistance with FDA policies, enforcement, toxicology, and submissions. Today's presenter is Tom Jonaitis. Tom is an independent consultant with EAS Consulting Group and has worked for 15 years with the food and dietary supplement industries, providing expert advice in navigating the regulatory requirements for novel ingredients in the US, Canada, EU, and Australia. Tom's work has included conducting regulatory, feasibility, and safety assessments, helping companies address data gaps, and compiling regulatory submissions. As a reminder, during today's webinar, you may ask any questions by typing them into the questions box. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over first to Tom.
Thanks, Amy. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to some if you're on the West Coast. I'm very happy to be here to discuss Prop 65 with you all, and hope that you gain some valuable insights from the topic at hand. Our agenda will cover a brief regulatory overview, just to bring everyone up to speed. We'll just discuss enforcement. Some common misconceptions. We often get very similar type questions regarding Prop 65, so we've kind of compiled those into some key areas. Some food and supplement specific issues that relate to Prop 65, and then finally some compliance strategies and tools for addressing this regulation. So Prop 65 is officially known as the Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act, and it started with very good intentions, and it was focused on things like clean drinking water and discharges, and it has expanded to now cover pretty much any type of product being sold into California. And the idea is still there, and there's proponents that discuss the fact that Prop 65 being stricter than some federal requirements has really pushed companies and manufacturers to screen their products or whatnot to remove certain chemicals that have been prevalent. But there are certainly negative aspects of this regulation that we'll discuss as well. So it's a right to know legislation, and it prohibits knowingly exposing consumers to any of the listed chemicals without first providing a clear and reasonable warning if such an exposure exceeds the safe harbor levels. So it's not a ban of any use of any chemicals or the sale of any types of products. It's just whether or not you need to provide a warning. It's administered by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or sometimes colloquially referred to as OEHA, which is part of Cal EPA, and requires them to publish a list of chemicals that have been found to be carcinogens or reproductive developmental toxins. The latest list was from January 3rd. List contains over 900 chemicals, covers everything from heavy metals, pesticides, even certain food products and other sort of chemical synthesis, reaction byproducts, impurities, things of that nature. As mentioned, it applies to almost nearly any product being sold. Drugs are ones that are exempt from Prop 65 as they're already covered at the federal level, but it still covers pretty much anything else, and it also includes packaging. There is an exemption for small businesses that's, officially, if you have less than 10 employees, you are exempt from Prop 65, full stop. But downstream customers sometimes request information about whether products are compliant. And then some big retailers, if you're trying to sell into, for example, like the Walmarts or through the Amazon, you have to make a declaration and completely indemnify them from any sort of Prop 65 or other compliance issues. So they get a letter of a notice of violation. They're basically pushing it right back onto the small business. So despite that exemption, in practical terms, they sometimes still have to look into Prop 65 compliance regardless. So we have this list that keeps being populated with new chemicals. How do those chemicals get added? There are basically 4 mechanisms, and the first 2 are the most important ones. So authoritative bodies, that's when another agency outside of California determines a chemical is a carcinogen or reprotoxin. So that can be IARC, NTP, US EPA, FDA, and various other agencies that are considered authoritative, and it becomes an automatic listing. So we'll discuss a few issues with regards to differences when there's a discrepancy between, for example, US EPA and IARC, and what California has to do. But essentially, they just automatically list it. So they don't even look at the data. If it's on any of these lists, it's going on the Prop 65 list. Or state qualified experts. That's where the Cal EPA OEHA appointed expert panels. They have one for cancer, one for reprotoxicity. They have chemicals that are nominated, and then they review the data and determine, yes, it should be listed, or no, it shouldn't. That's where they actually look into the data. Just formally required. This is, related to federal and state requirements, and is not typically used. And then there's a labor code, which kind of typically relates to how the list was originally created, and had various, occupational type chemicals that were listed. Again, it's not that commonly used. And it's important to note that once a chemical is listed, it gives companies have a 1-year grace period before warnings are required. So then you have 1 year to figure out what you want to do, assess your products, provide warnings, reformulate, or, do whatever you need to do, because then after the 1 year, it is open for enforcement. So what are these safe harbor levels? So this is basically a threshold that determines whether a warning is required. And it's all based on a daily exposure basis. So although there's 900 chemicals, only about 1/3 of those chemicals have safe harbor levels derived by OEHA. Fortunately, most of the highest risk chemicals that are enforced the most do have safe harbor levels already. But otherwise, they have a whole long list of chemicals that they're going to derive safe harbor levels for. There's a priority list. It has been updated since 2012, so it's not very helpful. It's all based on as government agencies, they're typically underfunded, understaffed, so there's just not enough time to be able to go through them all. So in the absence of one being published, then you have to derive one. A company has to derive one themselves or get help doing that. So for carcinogens, it's called a no significant risk level. The numbers really don't specifically matter here. This is how they define what is a cancer risk. It's one excess case of cancer in 100,000 individuals exposed over their lifetime, and typically requires compiling all the cancer data for that chemical. So whether it's done in rodents or if there's evidence in humans, you have to compile all that, and you typically run computer modeling to obtain a value of a comparable NSRL. Oops. For reproductive toxins, it's called the maximum allowable dose level, and it's, again, based on animal, human data. It's officially 1/1000th of a no observed effect level, but again, it can be used using computer benchmark tools as well. So in some cases, some of these apply to foods and dietary supplements. There is an exemption for certain chemicals that basically they've specified that it is not a risk by the oral route. So asbestos isn't going to be relevant, but certain metals present in a product aren't oral cancer risk. But you have to be careful because, for example, cadmium is also listed for repro and developmental toxicity. So you still have to look at it from that perspective. This is helpful because this automatically gives a very clear indication that it's not an oral cancer risk. There are a lot of chemicals that have been listed because they have been found to be carcinogenic, or that's the typical case, by various other routes. So it's only based on an inhalation study of fumes, let's say, for various types of metals or other examples, but they don't define that it's only applicable to that route. So then a company has to figure out, okay, is that even relevant? Like if it's causing cancer from inhalation, but it's only in relation to the nasal cavity because that's where it impacts, is that an oral cancer risk? Well, that's where you have to, look at the data and make a decision on that. There's another exemption for, this is for restaurants. There's a lot of text on here. We're not going to necessarily read it all, but basically they're saying that there are exemptions for chemicals that are on the list that are created during the preparation of food to make it palatable or to avoid microbial contamination. So you'd think that this was applied to something like acrylamide. This is something we'll discuss later, where it's not added to the food products, but it is created during the process because, you know, without roasting the beans, it's not going to be palatable. But this has proven to be quite an issue in actually using this as a defense. As we'll see, many companies were still being targeted for acrylamide and other chemicals that are just a natural byproduct of the cooking process. So it's kind of the issue with Prop 65, where there are a lot of kind of incongruencies with respect to what's being stated and what companies are actually able to use to defend themselves. So moving into warnings. So how can you relay these warnings if they're required? They can be on some sort of sign or tag that at the point of display of the actual product. So that would be like a shelf tag or some sort of other sign. Via an electronic device that automatically provides the warning to the purchaser before purchasing without them requiring to seek out a warning. So this is either, I assume, a digital display that someone can look at, because I'm not sure how else they'd be able to relay that to someone without having them to seek it. On product warnings, so you can have the full warning and truncated, which we'll discuss. So that's right on the product label somewhere. The warning's right there. Is there another one? And then online is for digital online sales. It has to be associated with the product. Again, full or truncated, so people see it with that product. This shows that, you know, when you're doing warnings, you cannot just provide a blanket statement at the beginning of the website. This is the same for catalogs. You can't just have one warning at the beginning of the catalog. It has to be specifically associated with each product, which obviously can create some, you know, logistical issues of being able to fit all these warnings and issues, at least in catalogs. For online sales, it's just associated with the product. You need to provide it on the website and on the product, and they have to match. And it cannot be anywhere where a person has to look for it. So it has to be very obvious and clear. So it can't be hidden somewhere behind in some sort of insert that, you know, they may or may not read. And in some cases, you can't just put one warning at just like you can't do blanket warnings online. You can't do blanket warning necessarily for every possible exposure at a public entrance. Now, this is already getting a little bit older, but in case some people are more familiar, because, you know, people still mention it, that, you know, after 2018, we had a change in the type of warnings that are required. We had a very blanket type warning that didn't even list anything, that people put everywhere as a precaution. Now, there's a little bit of an update where you have to have the triangle. You have to actually list one of the chemicals for why you're providing the warning, and then provide the web link to the state agency website regarding Prop 65. And that's, you know, in theory, when they published that, they were saying that they were going to collect information from companies that have warnings on their products to give consumers more information about, you know, where in the product the chemicals are listed, how is the you know, what is the amount of exposure, and to provide more context on the website. I'm not sure exactly, you know, they still haven't really, I don't think, done anything like that. But that was a theory of what this warning is about. Because people, if they see this warning on your product, they're going to go to this website probably thinking they're going to get more information about your product. That's not really the case, although that in theory was how, you know, that might proceed in the future. So then we also have a truncated warning. Here's another example of Prop 65 being a little bit mixed up in some cases. So the truncated warning here, again, has the triangle, the warning in bold, the hyperlink, but all you have to say for the truncated warning is cancer, or if it's, you know, and reproductive harm, or you just put reproductive harm, and that's it. You don't have to list the chemical for why you're providing the warning. Now, this was meant to be as a way to help companies that have products with very small packages or labels. For whatever reason, they didn't actually state it in the regulations as such. So based on discussions with trade associations, industry groups, and legal experts, using the truncated warning is perfectly legal and acceptable, as long as you're matching your warnings between online and on product. So if you use truncated on, you have to use truncated on both, or the full length warning on both. And because of the prevalent use of this truncated warning, it seems that OEHA has indicated that they may look into it, because obviously that's not in the spirit of why they gave this truncated warning option. So they may look at it in the future. So if you're using truncated warnings, just be aware that, you know, everything is pretty slow with OEHA, that down the road at some point they could change it. So you might have to adjust your use of this type of warning. But there will be time for, you know, they put out comment periods, and so you'll have plenty of time to prepare for that. Moving into enforcement. So this is a very unique aspect of, you know, regulatory compliance in comparison to other federal or even other jurisdictions, whether you're looking at Europe, Canada, anywhere. And it's not through the government, but it's through civil enforcement. So basically, you know, individuals in conjunction with, you know, lawyers basically are out there looking for products that are allegedly non-compliant. And this is done through the Attorney General office. So they file all these notices through the Attorney General's office. And what happens is basically what's called a notice of violation is issued to a company for a specific product, saying, so they basically buy products, they go test them at a lab, find out, oh, it's got some lead, it's got whatever the case may be, and say, hey, you have a product, it does not have a warning, and we found, and it should, because it has a chemical on the Prop 65 list. And you know, what hangs over it is that officially on the books, penalties of $2,500 per day for each violation, and each exposure is a violation. So if you're selling, you know, hundreds or thousands of supplement products on a daily basis, you know, each exposure to an individual is considered a violation. And so, you know, in practical terms, you know, even with even food products, there's discussions with like French fries and all sorts of things where you're looking at just ridiculously astronomical penalties that would, if you calculate it out like this, I don't think it's probably ever happened that anyone's paid out these actual fees, these fines, because most of the time, most of the cases are settled before they get to that stage. So, because it would just be nearly trillions of dollars, and it just doesn't make logical sense, but it all gets actually, you know, filtered down into a different calculation when the time comes. So through this settlement process, so basically, you know, you're given a notice of violation, you can defend yourself if you're fully, you know, in compliance. What's hanging over this in this case is that, you know, you might have to go to court to defend yourself. So that's obviously very time consuming, very expensive. Neither side actually wants to go to court to fight, but, you know, the plaintiffs, the noticing or the enforcement parties, you know, that's more in their favor, because they can just say, nope, sorry, we're going to court. And you have to consider the options of, you know, if you lose, you have to pay the other side's legal fee. So it can get very, very expensive. So a lot of the times it's much simpler and, you know, relatively less expensive to just settle. So basically you're paying them a settlement fee and then agreeing to certain terms, such as a testing scheme. So you're going to test your product for every 6 months for 2 years or whatever the case is, to ensure that now you're in compliance. Concentration limits. So you're going to say, okay, we're going to ensure that the product contains only so much of whatever chemical is the issue, or you have to provide warnings. So it creates a huge incentive for companies just to steal. And once they find one company, let's say you're selling sunglasses or a certain type of product or food, they find the chemical in one product, they can very easily then send multiple of these notice of violations to other companies that sell a very similar or identical product. So, and companies that are unprepared end up settling and paying out, and that's just an easy money machine for these enforcement parties. So companies that are prepared are on better grounds to be able to fight back, push back, and, you know, and try and limit these effects. These settlements are specific. So, you know, when we say there's a concentration limit for your product in that chemical, that's published in court documents, but they are specific to those companies that are part of that settlement process. So, you know, many labs and some companies use those settlement limits as a reference point, but it should be clear that, you know, if you have compliance issues, you can't actually use that as a defense by itself. You can't just say, well, there's a settlement limit over here for 500 parts per million. And they'll say, well, that's not relevant to you unless you've actually done the work of calculating it out and being able to support why 500 parts per million is relevant to your product. So it still takes a little bit more work. So here's a graph of just the settlement and enforcement trends. So you can see from 2011 to 2018, the number of notice of violations, the number of settlements, and the settlement cumulative settlement amounts have been increasing. And we can see that, you know, in 2018, which is the last year we have data for, they still haven't published 2019, we had just over $35 million worth of settlements being paid out. And on average, that works out to about $40,000 per settlement. So that's what companies are facing by just being targeted. 2019, we had 2,400 notice of violation issued. And as of this morning, there have been about 2,500 notice of violation sent already. So up to September 24th, we've already exceeded all of the violations for 2019. So we still have a few months to go. And so that just indicates that, you know, again, the pandemic certainly didn't slow down the enforcement activities for these bounty hunter lawyers. Now, where does that money go? So again, this is for 2018, but roughly almost 80% goes into attorney's fees and costs. So that goes straight into their pocket. And then only about 17% go to the actual civil penalties portion, which goes basically back to the state. So creates a huge incentive to just keep this moving. Getting into some common misconceptions, you know, that might help clarify a few things regarding how you approach Prop 65 from the get-go. So there is no one test. You can't just have a product and say, hey, test it for Prop 65, because each chemical and each matrix needs a specific type of test. So if you're testing, you know, acrylamide in French fries versus, you know, heavy metals in supplements, it's a different type of test. The costs are different, and, you know, it's a totally different requirement. So you have to come up with a list first of, we need to test these products for these chemicals and these ones for these chemicals, and you have to narrow that list down, because obviously there's 900 chemicals on the list, but there are only a small portion of those that are going to be relevant to any type of product. So it's just being able to narrow that down to, you know, what's actually relevant, because you're not going to test for everything, and that doesn't make any sense. There's no methods prescribed. There's just the regulations basically state that you just have to use the most sensitive methods. So you never want to be caught, you know, testing for a metal that only goes down to 100 parts per million when there's another method that's readily available that can go down to 5 parts per million. Because obviously you'll miss something if you're using the less sensitive test. And, you know, so you don't have to go to Herculean efforts, but you have to make sure you're getting the most robust method that's, you know, accepted or validated. There's no deminimis concentration. So some regulations like REACH or whatnot have a limit where, you know, your product cannot contain, or material cannot contain more than 0.1%, 1% of a certain chemical. For Prop 65, everything comes down to exposure. So 10 parts per million might be okay for one product, and it's totally not an issue. For another type of product, 10 parts per million may be way over the exposure limit, or the safe harbor limit. So unfortunately, there's nothing you can just point to automatically to say it's too low for consideration. And compliance with other regulations, whether it's in the US or overseas, doesn't mean that you're compliant with Prop 65. There are some overlaps. For example, the REACH SVHC list has many chemicals that are on the Prop 65 list, especially the ones that are, you know, most targeted or the highest risk, but not necessarily all of them. So you have to be careful. But information that you have regarding test reports or analysis that you've done to say, oh, our product's compliant with REACH, that can help, because, you know, that at least eliminates a lot of chemicals that you may have needed to test for Prop 65. And then you just have to cross-reference to make sure that there's, you know, nothing major that you still need to test for on top of that. So some food-related issues, this also applies to, you know, to supplements as well, is the natural occurring exemption. This is a big one under Prop 65. Basically, where there's no exposure to a listed chemical if it's considered to be naturally occurring in that item. And then, if it's in food, then it can be applied to also to dietary supplements and cosmetics. But the issue is that you have to specifically define that it's naturally occurring, so that it's naturally in the product or material, or it's absorbed from the environment. There has to be clear evidence of that. It also has to basically, you have to show that it's not related to human activity, or you have to separate out how much of it is man-made or pollution related versus naturally present. And you have to show that it's the levels that you have cannot that you've taken all your good agricultural manufacturing practices, and it cannot be lowered anymore, and that it's at the lowest level currently feasible. So that being said, this is very complex. Like, whether there can be natural variations in the levels. So if you're taking, some sort of plant-based product, whether it's overseas or over here, different parts of the states, you could have different natural levels of some of these chemicals, whether it's, heavy metals or whatnot. So they make it very difficult, to define how much is natural and how much is man-made. That being said, the regulations actually provide certain thresholds for what they consider naturally occurring. So, and this was in for inorganic arsenic in white and brown rice. So basically, if your rice product contains less than these levels indicated here, 80 parts per billion and 170 parts per billion, those are not considered exposures that trigger a warning. So in that case, these are considered natural. If your levels go beyond that, though, then you're getting into the territory of having to calculate whether you're exceeding the safe harbor levels for arsenic. A couple other ones that come up is three chemicals: methyl-eugenol, beta-myrcene, and pulazone. These are naturally found in a wide range of plant products. So if you're using these chemicals are in your products, but they're based on being present because you're using peppermint or basil or other types of ingredients, that's considered naturally occurring, and there's an exemption for that, and that's acceptable. If you're adding methyl-eugenol by itself, then it's not exempt, and you have to address Prop 65 in that case. So there's some big cases that discuss sort of naturally occurring versus man-made. There's methylmercury in 2009, finally finished. This was a huge case. They finally won. It was a huge court case with a lot of experts on both sides discussing where the mercuries come from and the cycling and the environmental aspects, and ultimately found a level that was considered naturally occurring. There was other cases, lead in various fruit products. They couldn't necessarily define where it was coming from, but they couldn't also determine that how much of it was natural or not. So because of that, they basically lost that case, and that's what happened. There's another one that's ongoing still is lead in certain types of chili and tamarind-based candies. So, there have been settlements. They basically said 100 parts per billion is okay, and this is consistent with FDA. But, for example, in this case, CEH is pressing that it's still too high because people can eat these candies, frequently, and they're trying to limit it down to 30 parts per billion. So this is still being an ongoing issue. Another big one with foods is BPA, found in various can and jar linings and receipt papers, listed as a female reproductive toxin. Basically, OEHA had to publish emergency warnings at point of sale to basically tell people that, we're going to provide the warning. Grocery stores, you just put this at the checkouts, and this will cover you. Because they were worried that, when BPA was listed, that grocery stores were going to just start dumping canned foods because they were worried of whether they needed warnings or not. And based on the enforcement activity, they didn't want to get caught up in anything. So that, protected those grocery stores and food manufacturers of canned products or in bottles and other packaging that contained BPA linings. And of course, OEHA derived a dermal MADL, but didn't derive an oral one. So, typically from these sorts of use scenarios, oral would be more significant, but there's more federal research being done on BPA to figure out, the best science to derive an oral MADL. Moving into acrylamide. So this was a big one. Since about 2002, there was over 800 notice of violations issued to food companies. And I think as many as about 300 even just last year. So it's been dramatically increasing, and it's found in a wide range of products. And, currently, based on those court settlements, there's limits of about 10 parts per billion to 350, depending on the different food type. And, but even before that, there's been many millions paid out due to enforcement activity for acrylamide, which is ridiculous because acrylamide doesn't cause cancer in foods, but there you have it. So now, kind of given to the huge, issues with acrylamide being targeted, there have been a number of exemptions. So for example, in 2018, breakfast cereals were exempt from requiring warnings due to acrylamide, because it, ran counter to FDA's message regarding, the consumption of cereals and other type of foods that are considered, part of a balanced meal. Finally, in 2019, there was a coffee exemption. So any chemicals in coffee that have been on the list prior to March 15th are exempt from requiring warnings. So there are a few other chemicals that are in coffee that, are on the list. So this gives them a blanket statement. There are many companies that are still fighting to get out of the grasps of a huge court case regarding acrylamide in coffee. Hopefully they can, win out over this. And again, just recently, OEHA has proposed maximum levels of acrylamide in various foods that wouldn't constitute an exposure. So a similar exemption for as for coffee, except for, I think in this case, it's only related to acrylamide, not other chemicals, but that might, change in the end. There are some questions about how they came up with these levels. You have to show, again, that the acrylamide levels are as low as feasibly possible. So there's some fine tuning in the manufacturing process, you can actually account for acrylamide and see, how you can reduce it. So that'll be kind of interesting to see how that all kind of shakes out. I think it's still during in a comment period, and we'll see how, I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of comments on that when it comes out. Some other big issues. So furfuryl alcohol is similar to acrylamide. It's produced during baking and roasting. So we'll see if, and there hasn't been a huge amount of activity with this chemical, but it's still been around for a couple of years now, being targeted here and there. So we'll see if the exemption will cover furfuryl alcohol. Glyphosate is a agricultural chemical, and it was listed. This was a big one, and this is going into a discussion regarding First Amendment free speech, where US EPA did not find that glyphosate is carcinogenic. And that's a US agency looking at all the data. However, overseas, IARC, the International Agency on Research in Cancer, determined that glyphosate is carcinogenic. And so then OEHA then listed glyphosate because they said this is an automatic listing by the authoritative bodies mechanism. IARC found it to be a carcinogen. We're putting it on the list. And now many companies are fighting it because they're saying, well, now this is, compelled speech, and, what is going on with, why do we need to put, is it truthful to say it causes cancer if EPA says it's not carcinogenic? It goes into that whole discussion. And I think right now, the federal level statement regarding US EPA not finding it carcinogenic is how companies can go forward. But again, this is going to be a big court case that is ongoing. Fortunately, OEHA did derive a no significant risk level for glyphosate. So at least companies have something to point to. It's a relatively high level or a pretty high threshold. So I think that most companies should be covered. But again, you have to look into it. And then there was others where lead and cadmium was found in various chocolate products, and there were settlements around that. So now we can go into the compliance tools and strategies. So, you're going to be taking a look, because obviously, it's definitely the case. An ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure, because addressing it, even just a small amount of due diligence and looking through and getting information on your compliance can go a long way in protecting you from, obvious issues that might come up. And, with average settlements of, $40,000 just for being targeted, it's well worth, everyone's effort to, just do a bit of work to try and figure this out, because it'll go a long way. So what can you do? Okay, the easy way, you could just put a label on it. You could put a label on your product. But, obviously in the food and supplement industry, you do not want warnings unless you absolutely have to. And even then, you might want to add some additional context regarding, what the specific case is. Prophylactically adding warnings on everything is technically not compliant with the regulations, because, warnings are only required when exposure exceeds the threshold, but companies sometimes want to just protect themselves and be extra cautious. So typically you want to break this down into 3 steps, and this kind of makes it so that it's very kind of clear and well documented, the process you're going through in a stepwise fashion. So first, you need to understand if there are any chemicals or impurities that might be present, or that you need to ascertain and confirm that they are not present. And you check your ingredients, check your formulations, press suppliers to provide more documentation if they aren't already, regarding, certificates of analysis and test reports. And, if not, then, even declarations can at least put some sort of context around what they are aware of or what they can say about it. Test data is going to be the most robust, because it's clear, black and white evidence. A declaration, you have to basically take their word for it. But if you have, strong relationship with your supplier and they seem very robust and diligent with all their paperwork and documentation, then that could very well be fine. Oops, sorry, I got a little cut off here. Otherwise, you have to kind of do some additional research. If you have certain types of materials or products or ingredients, you might just have to search further through scientific literature to say, okay, what else could be in here? Because it's, suppliers may not be aware of certain impurities, but if they're present, then you have to be aware of them yourself. So in foods and supplements, kind of the bottom line with regards to what you should really be focusing on is obviously heavy metals. Like lead is like the #1 chemical that's going to be an issue. Dietary supplements are targeted every month for heavy metals. And so you want to ensure that your raw materials and your final products should have a very tight specification limits for heavy metals. Those are the biggest ones. If you address those, that'll carry you most of the way. Obviously, there could be other types of, depending on what your ingredients are, what they're made of, where they come from, all that. There could be other chemicals that might be relevant, but those are the ones that are going to be your biggest red flag. So once you've narrowed down a list of what you need to test and what you need to confirm, you need to, test the products and, confirm whether they're actually there and in what amount. You may need to prioritize. Get your major chemicals done first. And if there are, there could be a long list of potential chemicals. And so sometimes it helps to prioritize, to focus in on the ones that are going to be the biggest issue. And then, just in general, testing your final products for heavy metals and acrylamide for certain types of foods are going to be the biggest, hot top, red flag type issues right now. But that doesn't exclude other chemicals that might be present. And if you test your products and you have a report that basically says, okay, no, it was not detected, there is a part of the regulation that specifically states that there is no discharge or exposure if you have that sort of result. So if you are targeted, you can just point to your lab result and say, look, it gives you basically a 1-year, protection for that product to basically say, it's fine. This again could be another issue of like, you know, how in practical terms, because if some sort of bounty hunter is out testing your products and finds you've tested your product and it's negative for all heavy metals, they test it, something comes up, it might still become an argument of like, well, whose test results are more valid or whatever the case may be. And let me just tell you that it's always an uphill battle for companies regarding fighting these bounty hunters, because there's stuff on paper like you should be exempt, it's not an exposure, but yet you might still have to argue it out. The final stage is exposure. So you need to relate the quantity of the chemical in a product or ingredient to the safe harbor level to determine if a warning is required. So, you know, first you got to check, is there a safe harbor level? If not, then you have to have one derived. And then you have to estimate how much of that chemical a person would be exposed to per day. So obviously for supplements, it's relatively straightforward because, you know, they're being instructed to consume it on a very, you know, there's a recommended dosage per day. So it's much more straightforward. For foods, it can be more complex. You know, it's not just the serving size. It's, you know, you have to have try and build some sort of argument or basis for stating how much consumption would be per day. So you just have to be careful with that. You know, the US FDA RACCs per eating occasion provide some references for, you know, how much someone will eat and that's again per eating occasion. So that may not necessarily be per day. It could be per, you know, individual meal or something. So you need to try and create a substantiated argument for why you're picking a certain amount versus another. And it's obviously always better to be a little more conservative so that, you know, no one can poke holes in your estimate. And sometimes this can, you know, be relatively straightforward if you're, you know, referring to some sort of energy bars or granola bars or other kind of very defined type of products versus saying breads or grains or other things where you might need to use dietary intake modeling to come up with estimates for people at, you know, across the board. Once you have your estimate, then you make your comparison. And so if the exposure is greater than the safe harbor level on the left here in the red square, then a warning is triggered. So you have an option then. You can either put a warning or try and figure out how to reformulate or adjust, or if there's one ingredient that's really pushing that result, you can figure out if you can get that ingredient to have an even lower specification for that chemical to help make your product compliant. But if exposure is below the safe harbor level, then no Prop 65 warning is required, and you just, you know, keep all this information, all the test reports and review as documentation and evidence of your due diligence to use if there's questions or, you know, God forbid you're targeted, you have your ammunition in your back pocket. So another option to have a greater defense is you can obtain a safe use determination directly from OEHA. This is basically a written determination of compliance of a product with Prop 65, and it's specific to a company, product, and the particular details. So they can say this product containing X amount of this chemical was found to be compliant with this regulation, and therefore it's basically clear from any sort of enforcement activity. So it can be a reference point for other companies, but no one else can use that as a direct, you know, protection for themselves. There's one, I think, ongoing now for a certain agricultural chemical in food products, but most of them have been related to like construction materials, like roofing tiles and carpet tiles, and, you know, other things that they've assessed, which I guess made more sense, and sunglasses. So not that many related to food or supplements yet, but that might change. The only thing is you have to first do the assessment yourself. Then you have to submit it to OEHA. Then you're paying their fees for the labor of reviewing and doing their own assessment. And so this can take a lot of time. It can be, you know, it's more expensive because then you're paying that additional aspect of having OEHA do it, but it's ironclad protection. So in summary, the key takeaways are, you know, first things first is just understanding Prop 65 and that you pretty much certainly have to address it and do something about it before you are targeted. Screening, you need to have a snapshot and understand where your risks lie and for what. So, this can often be, in some cases, you can have suppliers provide that information, and that'll get you a lot of the way, so you don't have to do everything yourself. But ultimately, the final product is the key element that you're going to want to evaluate and see. Are your specifications tight enough for heavy metals to, accommodate the safe harbor levels? What do you do? I mean, the lead safe harbor level is very low, but still, you want to know how far off you are, or what the situation is. So you certainly want to take a look first to, see what it all looks like, where your risks are. You can prioritize and put different products in different buckets and figure out what you want to do with each of those. Quantification is the third kind of thing that we have to remember is, get information you can from suppliers. Otherwise, testing is going to provide the most robust evidence. And that's a lot more, robust in determining that your product is compliant than trying to calculate out based on all the individual raw materials or ingredients. The exposure assessment part, you have to ensure that, get a grasp on what the exposure is to determine if those warnings are actually required. And then vigilance. You have to keep looking. You have to keep, whether it's periodic testing, whether it's making sure that you're aware of any changes in your supply chain. If one of your suppliers changes, or they have changed their manufacturing process and changed, the specs have changed, like those are things that you're going to need to be aware of to see how that might impact you, or impact your final product. And I have to be very open and clear that if any product that doesn't have a warning has potential to be investigated or targeted, because if they have a warning, that's not really worth their time to be investigating. So it seems kind of unfair that you could still be targeted and have to go through a rigmarole with them, but at least you're going to be much further ahead in having documentation, understanding Prop 65, being ready for it, because, they send out all these notice of violations. Certain companies are just going to pay it and be like, oh, okay, it's cost of doing business. And that's, how they enjoy making their money. But companies that are ready to fight back, it's a lot bigger headache for them. And there's better chance that they might reduce or even eliminate settlements where they basically back off and say, okay, I'm out of here. This company isn't a pushover. I'm going to go find some, lower hanging fruit. So if you have, I think we're going to go into our Q&A session. So if you have any questions, feel free to submit them. If we don't get to them, we'll be happy to try and follow up with you and answer any questions that you may have.
Tom, thank you so much. That is a fantastic presentation. And we do have a number of questions. I hope we have time to get to all or most. The first question is, does this apply to all e-commerce businesses located outside of California?
Yes. So if you're selling into California, then it does still apply to you.
Okay.
The question regarding the enforcement aspect of how they would, like if you're purely an entity overseas and someone targeted your product, like, I mean, I think that's more of a legal question of how do they, because you may not even have a US based distributor or anything. So how you get actually, through the legal process of being targeted and having someone try and come after you is more of a legal question that, I'm not in a position to answer. But officially, anybody selling into California has to comply with Prop 65.
Are there any exemptions from using the triangular warning symbol on food and supplement product labels?
Exemptions? So I'm not sure what you mean by exemptions. I mean, by using the warnings, I mean, you can, if you have to use the warnings, you use either the long form or the short form. Now, coffee is exempt, and breakfast cereals are exempt from acrylamide, but that doesn't mean they're exempt from other chemicals. So So I'm not sure if I've answered your question. Feel free to kind of resubmit with some additional details, and I can maybe follow up on it.
Thank you. Next question. If as a manufacturer you sell a product through a distributor in another state who then distributes your product into California without your knowledge, is the manufacturer responsible for labeling the Prop 65?
Yes. So they would be responsible for it. So, I mean, if you know that if you're also selling into California and know that it requires a Prop 65 warning, then you would need to relay that information to that distributor. If you're unaware or you do not sell into California, you've not looked into your Prop 65 obligations because you can guarantee that you're not selling at all into California directly, then it would fall on the distributor. One thing that companies can add in these sorts of situations is an indemnity to basically say, you know, we don't sell into California. We don't know the compliance of Prop 65. Anything related to Prop 65 is on your hands and you're going to be liable for it. So that they can't come back and say, well, they gave me this product and they didn't tell me about it. It's like, well, that might need to be clarified with some agreements. But otherwise, if you have no sales in California and someone else sells it, it's up to them.
Is it okay to put the warning on a product just to be safe, even if you don't know the exact data?
Companies do that for sure because it's almost guaranteed way not to be targeted. You know, if you ask the agency, they'll say, well, no, that's not necessarily appropriate. It's not in the spirit of the regulation because they only want warnings on things that need it. So it's up to companies to take that path if they feel that that's the best course of action for them.
If a chemical has a NSRL and MADL, do both of these safe harbor levels need to be accounted for?
Yes. So if chemicals are listed for more than one endpoint, you have to look into it for both. So basically, if you calculate it out and it's not a cancer risk, because again, you have to also factor in cancers evaluated kind of over a lifetime of exposure. So that can be amortized where someone only consumes something once per month over, maybe their lifetime. That gets averaged out. So the average dose of that chemical is averaged out over 365 days, even though they've only consumed it on 12 days. But for reproductive developmental toxins, those are considered to be potentially toxic through a single exposure. So you can't really average it out. And so you have to be careful where, something may not be a cancer risk, so you don't need warnings for cancer, but it still may need a warning for reproductive or developmental toxicity.
Is there any exemption for companies that have less than 10 employees?
Yeah, so that was at the beginning of the presentation. There is an exemption for, you're technically, if you're less than 10 employees, you do not need to comply with Prop 65 or, you're exempt, full stop. But your customers, your retailers may still not only, ask you about it, they may require you to basically declare that your product's compliant. So you still get stuck having to look into it. So it's up to you. Like, I mean, if you're under 10 and no one's asking you, then you can just go on your merry way. But you may run into issues where you do need to answer the question about Prop 65, and then, you could tell them I'm exempt and see where it gets you. But I think that most companies want to, keep gaining more customers and therefore might have to do a little bit of work. And again, it's not a huge amount of work usually to try and get some clarity on your Prop 65 compliance.
How do we evaluate if a warning is needed for a multi-ingredient product?
You're basically looking at it from the final product perspective. So your dietary supplement, let's say, is made of 20 ingredients. So you're going to test your final product, again, for the major chemicals, your heavy metals. What does it come back as? If there are plant-based ingredients, you may have to look into, pesticide screens or some sort of information, but it's all based on the final ingredient. So when someone consumes that capsule or whatever it is, what is their exposure to your key chemicals? With foods, it gets a little more complicated. Sometimes it's like a issue where it's, relatively straightforward, where, it's like olive oil or something. That's more easy to look at. If you're looking at something like a pizza, that may come about having to look at it more individually because it's difficult. You can't just test it all in one big mash. I mean, maybe you could, but that's a question where it kind of is more product specific.
Are you covered for 1 year in the future of a negative test or 1 year in the past, 1 year prior?
From the date of the test to
Going
1 year
forward.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question is the safe harbor level based on consumption of the reviewed product, meaning a product specific, or is it based on consumption of all food per day?
So that exposure is based on it's exposure in the course of a day. So if you have, I'm trying to think of an example, like I don't know, let's just say milk, let's say, or yogurt or something. Let's say milk. That product might be consumed repeatedly through the day. Let's say if a kid is consuming it, they could eat it at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or whatever the case is. You have to try and come up with some exposure. It's their exposure over the course of a day, not just at breakfast or at one occasion. Other products may be just once per day, and then that's the same as an individual intake. But for others, it depends, and it could be, you know, it's all based on per day.
Next question, if you're reviewing raw materials for Prop 65 and the raw materials supplier provides a range, would you recommend using the upper range? As you can imagine, this could prompt a warning when one might not really be needed.
That's a very good question. I would say that in those sorts of situations, you have to take a look. And if they're saying, yeah, like if you're calculating it out and the high end goes over and the low end doesn't, I would say then either try and get them to provide more detailed information and say that you're trying to figure out Prop 65 compliance, or you know, that could just be so their specification is really the high end, saying it's not going to be more than 10 parts per million, and then you should, you know, either act accordingly and assume that it could be as high as 10 parts per million. So if they say 5 to 10 parts per million, you have to basically assume that it's at 10, because any other calculation could miss values. So you can either then get them to, you know, if that's their information that they have, then maybe that's all they get. You could test the product yourself to confirm whether you get it. But again, you can't just test one product. If they're saying that it's a range, then you know, you could test one product, it's 5, the next product's 7, the next product's 10. You're still in the same issue where you're using the high end. So I guess the answer is you have to use the high end and have to because you want to be conservative and protect yourself. So if that's the only real way you can do it.
Does it apply to products that are sold to food service companies?
Also a good question. That one. So in certain cases, food. Might have to check back on that one. I assume that it would be, because they need to ensure that they're compliant with Prop 65 when they're issuing food out. So unless there's a specific exemption, you know, for certain types of chemicals that we covered, like whether it's chemicals that are naturally produced or something else, they still have an obligation to comply with Prop 65. So I would say yes.
Are we in compliance if we display the Prop 65 warning statement as part of the checkout process rather than showing the warning on the product page prior to checkout?
Yeah, one option for online sales is you can like geo-fence the warnings, in the sense of that if someone puts in a California PO box, a message pops up to say, oh, you're from California. Please be aware, blah, blah, blah. Here's the warning. So for sure, you can do it anywhere as long as the person can see the warning prior to purchase, and that they don't have to seek it out. So they can't have like if you're going to use a hyperlink, you can use a hyperlink on the page to say, oh, for California residents, click here for Prop 65 warning, and then they click on that and they can go there. Or you can have it where it pops up during the checkout, as long as they can see it before they press purchase. So yes.
Does Prop 65 have anything to do with water supply, as in if the product is thrown away and contains lead, which could leach into the water supply, or is it strictly from ingestion of the product itself?
It's really from the direct exposure to the consumer, really. The discharges and safe water, all that stuff was based on like companies pumping, excess water and contaminating drinking water sources. In theory, because let's say you're throwing out a mug that has decorative paint on it that has lead on it, you throwing it out, it would be nearly impossible to calculate or expect that anyone would actually be exposed to that, because they would have to get into the water. How, who's exposed to that water, or, so it's just, that's really goes beyond what Prop 65 is really about. So it's really about just the during use, whether it's related to water lines or plumbing or whatever. It's all about, during use, installation, maintenance, use of the faucets. But once it goes into the garbage, Prop 65 technically stops. I'm sure there's maybe something out there that relates to it, but overall, that's really not what it's all about.
Okay, we're just past 2:00, but we'll take a few more questions. The next question: if a product contains several chemicals listed on the Prop 65 list, either carcinogen or reproductive toxins, if one chemical contains both hazards, can it be listed to cover both categories, or at least one chemical, or does at least one chemical need to be listed for both hazards?
Also a good question. So you need to list one or more chemicals for why the warning is provided. So if you have 3 chemicals and they're all carcinogens, then you only have to list one. You can list all 3 if you want. I'm not sure. Again, that's a very weird wording. Why would people list more chemicals than is necessary? They should say list all the chemicals or list, But anyway, so if they're all carcinogens, you only have to list one of those chemicals. If there are 2 carcinogens and 1 chemical that's both, then you would need to warn for both categories, and then you would still you could still list only one chemical that covers both. If so, chemical A is cancer and repro, and the other 2 chemicals are cancer, then you just list chemical A for cancer and repro. If 2 chemicals are cancer and 1 is repro, then you have to list 1 chemical for cancer and 1 chemical for repro or reproductive effects. So in that case, you're going to end up with 2 chemicals being listed because there's no overlap.
If you're an ingredient supplier located outside of California, can you provide your customer, the finished food manufacturer, information about the presence and amounts of Prop 65 chemicals in your product, allowing them to determine if a warning is required on a finished food product, or are you required to label your product?
No, if you're providing to another manufacturer who's going to make the finished good, your obligation, if you're not selling into California, then you don't have any obligation. But typically companies are out to, trying to help companies understand their compliance. In that situation, you would just inform them, because you can't account for every single way that your ingredient might be used and what levels, or, maybe it's obvious and maybe it's, in your case, in some cases it might be obvious that, whatever exposure it is, it would potentially exceed the exposure limit or the safe harbor level. But overall, you would just inform them with information to say, look, this is the test analysis for our ingredient. This can be helpful in determining your compliance of your end product with Prop 65. So unless you're supplying directly into California, you don't need to provide warnings. It's just supplying that information to anyone downstream as necessary.
Should products be retested annually?
That's, depending, that would be great. I think that's the ultimate way to kind of keep on top of it and insured. But if you have lots of products that, can become a little bit daunting. So, Prop 65 is really legal liability risk mitigation exercise in the end. It's not really, yes, it's about safety. Everyone's trying to make clean, healthy, good products. But when it comes to Prop 65, it takes it to the next level of kind of headaches and issues. And you have to determine sort of for yourself what the risks are for your product, what's the likelihood that there's going to be compliance issues, and how many products you have, how many chemicals are questioned, how much that's going to cost, and balance that. So the risk versus the cost of doing testing every year. Every year would be great, because then you're covering yourself off. It's a great way to ensure you have robust, up-to-date data protecting you. But that's not always necessarily feasible or practical in every case. So you have to balance it out on a company by company basis.
Okay, great. We'll take one more question. Before we do, I've noticed a handful that are questions regarding legal concerns and others regarding testing. And so for those who have asked those types of questions, if you're still in the audience, we'll provide separate information for you. So our last question: if a Prop 65 compliant product is run through a piece of machinery that has a Prop 65 warning, such as a carbonator, does the resulting product require a warning?
Can you read that one again?
If a Prop 65 compliant product is run through a piece of machinery that does have a Prop 65 warning, does it result in requiring its own Prop 65 warning?
Yeah. Well, that'll depend on what implications or impacts that machine imparted onto that product. So if the machine has a warning for whatever reason, you have to understand why it has the warning and whether running the product through the machine causes any chemicals to be introduced into it. Because if they are introduced into the product and the level results in a certain amount that would trigger it, then yes, then that product may become not compliant with Prop 65 all of a sudden, because that machine has imparted something or some sort of chemical into it. But if the machine has it for whatever reason and it runs through the machine and it doesn't change the composition of the product or any sort of doesn't impact it at all, then it remains Prop 65 compliant.
Great. Thanks everyone so much for joining us and for so many sticking with us through the end of the questions. We hope you've enjoyed the webinar. And thank you very much, Tom, for such a great presentation and such thorough Q&A at the end. We appreciate your interest in EAS and hope to see you at a future event soon. Thank you.